Well, thank you, Dr. Rincones, Dean Rincones, for this nice introduction. And I mean, she really gave us a segue into what this talk is about. And yeah, it is indeed about the significance of Africans in the history of Mexico and the significance of Africans in Mexican-American history. We tend to think, I mean, it's a common perception for many different reasons, that Latino cultures, that Latin American cultures and Mexican culture is more than anything the result of a mix between Europeans, especially Spanish, and Native Americans, especially Aztecs. And that is partly true. You know, that is fairly accurate to a degree. But like we all know, as good historians, and I see many historians here, hello, and history students, history is usually a lot more complex than what it looks at first sight. And so yeah, today I want to concentrate really on talking about the African presence, the African significance for the history of Mexico, and just to emphasize, a few points. I mean, we usually don't think of Mexico as an African-American country, but in colonial times, in the 16th century at least, in the 16th century, Mexico had the largest black population in the Western Hemisphere. In the 16th century, Mexico's African population was larger than that of Brazil, Cuba, Dominican Republic, United States, etc. And I mean, to give a little bit of background, we know that the Spanish showed up in 1519 in Mexico. Well, first they showed up in 1492 in the Bahamas, and then in 1519 in Mexico. And when they conquered Mexico, the population of Mexico, the indigenous population just of southern Mexico, was, in estimates vary, between 10 and 25 million people. I mean, that's a lot of people. That's 10 to 25 million. The diseases, the epidemic diseases that the Spanish introduced, that the Europeans introduced, along with massacres, along with forced labor and starvation, reduced that native population from, depends on your, on whose estimates you take, let's say the low estimate, 10 million, to about 1 million 100 years later. 1 million. Now, once you reach that bottom, once you reach that zenith, then it actually came back. And it skyrocketed. So the lowest point, the lowest ebb of the Native American population is around 1600, 1620, and it's at 1 million. And then it begins to grow. Well, besides that, of course, the Spanish came into Mexico, and they dominated Mexico as a colony from 1521 to 1821, 300 years. But in those 300 years, only about 200,000 Spanish migrated to Mexico. So you have, at the lowest step, you have a native population that is 1 million. You have no more than 200,000 Spaniards. Many of these are men who take Indian women and produce mestizo children. And the other part of the story that we don't hear a lot is that there were also about 200,000 African slaves that they recruited and brought. So what we have here is a population, a Mexican population, that we can argue to a degree that it's about 1 million Native Americans, 200,000 Africans, 200,000 Spaniards. So there's a major African presence here, at least as significant as that of the Spanish in numbers, and also culturally. And this actually leads to one of my conclusions, and it's, by the way, there are other people that have been making this argument. We have to credit the people who did. This argument begins to take off with Gonzalo Aguirre Beltrán in 1946 in a book that he wrote, La Presencia Africana en Mexico, or The African Presence in Mexico. So since 1946, he introduces this argument, and it doesn't get much track. It doesn't get a lot of airtime until the 1980s. And then, after the year 2000, it takes off with lots of people writing about it, myself included, okay? And so here, I mean, one of the conclusions from this is that Mexico is similar to many other Latin American countries, in which it is not only the result, it is not only a Spanish country. We have the Conquistador here in the middle, and this monument is actually in Puerto Rico, in the city of Dorado, the monument to the people Here, raza does not mean, it doesn't translate literally as race. It's the people. Monument to the people. And the people, they mean the mix of the Spaniards who came and conquered Native Americans, and the Native Americans who resisted and mixed with them. And then the presence of Africans. The presence of Africans, very, very important. So here the argument is that Mexico, in many ways, is similar to Puerto Rico. It's similar to Cuba. Where were the Africans in Mexico? Well, they were actually in all industries and throughout the entire colony. This is New Spain around 1819. And this is what eventually becomes Mexico. This is Spanish Mexico at the time, or Spanish colonial Mexico. And you find Africans everywhere, in all occupations, initially as slaves, but also something different is that in Mexico, in colonial Mexico, there are many different avenues for freedom, mostly because of the advocacy of the Catholic Church. So slavery, unlike the US, slavery is not, in most cases, it's not for a lifetime, it's not a lifetime condition, and it's also not hereditary, i.e. the children of slaves don't have to be slaves. So Africans are everywhere, but of course we find concentrations. And where are the largest concentrations of Africans? Well, it's on the tropics, because it's largely the stereotype that Spanish have that Africans can resist tropical diseases. So they are mostly in the tropics, and they will be here in this area. Actually here near the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. In this area here near the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, see, oh yeah, you can see the cursor, good. And you have large numbers here because these areas around Acapulco, they produce quite a bit of sugarcane, but the largest concentration by far is going to be around Veracruz. Okay, it's right here. This area, because this area that I'm highlighting here, or at least moving the cursor around, this is the sugar basket of colonial Mexico. And sugar has a lot to do with with Africans, because that's where the Spanish, going to be one of the most lucrative enterprises that the Spanish undertake in colonial Mexico, and it's one that is going to eat up Africans. Okay, so sugar slavery, the sugar fields are going to be just as brutal as those anywhere else. And these are death factories where people are worked to death within about 5 years. Meaning a young person can be enslaved, young person can be 16, this person most likely will not live to be 21 or 22. So this is like the context for today's talk. Okay, this map gives you some of the areas that had the largest concentrations of Africans. So of course you have this region, on the Pacific, and of course you have Veracruz, this area. But you see all these whole areas, and to me, this topic got my attention when I was a child, and I started to see, I look around and look at my brother, look at my mom, look at my uncles, and I said, we are descendants from Africans. We descend from Africans. I mean, look at my brother, look at my mom, look at my uncles. I mean, they look African, and I started to look at the mirror, and I said, and I look African too, to a degree. Okay, and so, yeah, sure enough, this comes from a book by Ben Vinson, Black Mexico. It's a great book. And he mentions about some of the settlements with the highest numbers of Africans. He mentions Celaya right here and Salvatierra. And he does not mention, but it should be there, Guanajuato, which was the richest, one of the two richest silver producing regions in colonial Latin America, the other one being Bolivia, Potosí in Bolivia. And many, especially in the 16th century, most of the people who worked at the mines were African slaves. And so I consider these people my ancestors, even though I have not sent a DNA sample to Ancestry.com or done of that. I am from that region, and I can see how that is true. Now, like I said, there were different avenues for freedom. Unlike the US, slavery was brutal, okay? And it's not a matter of where it was worse. It was horrible and it was brutal, and this is no excuse for anybody. But in the case of Mexico, of course, initially, especially in the 16th century, many of those enslaved were males, and they sought Indian partners, Native American partners, because slavery was inherited according to the condition of the mother. And so if the mother is free, i.e. a Native American, the child will be free. And this was true for much of the colonial period. And this is a casta painting, showing a slave father with his Native American wife and their child, and the children will be free. What happened in Mexico is that the Spanish developed this colonial labor of system based on this colonial system of labor based on debt, in which they indebted the workers, they extended lines of credit, they paid them very little, so to survive, workers had to borrow, and that way they got trapped in a system of debt peonage, and that worked even more effectively than slavery. But slavery was still very important throughout the 16th century. Here, the point of this image that you see here is the recent, I guess I can call it a renaissance of an African consciousness throughout Mexico, especially on the coastlines. This refers specifically to the Gulf of Mexico, to the city of Veracruz, and this is a mural that is in a museum in Veracruz. And it depicts here, of course, the Middle Passage, the slave ships, the punishment of slave ships, and then sugarcane. All of this is sugarcane. And then eventually what? Breaking the chains of slavery. And then in the background you have the Aztec sun. The Aztec calendar, I'm sorry. You have the Aztec calendar, meaning this is Mexico. So again, in both coastlines, in the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, these are the areas that have the largest concentrations of Africans, and that's where you see this consciousness more prevalent. Whereas in the rest of the country, many people ignore it, but not only ignore it, but deny it, i.e. many would be insulted if you tell them, do you have black ancestors? Even though, you see them, you talk to them, and you guess that they very probably do. But they would be insulted because of the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of colonial conquest and domination that put a stigma on blackness. This a very nice account of the story I'm about to tell you comes from Jane Landers, who's actually a friend of some of the people here. And I found one of her books, and this is one of my favorite books, and it includes a chapter. It includes one chapter on Mexico. And the book is about blacks in Latin Americans, and I really like this quote that she has on page 11. And this is the topic of today's talk. So I'm going to let Jane Landers introduce the topic. And it goes like this on page 111. In 1609, a troop of Africans playing drums and cowbells processed down a mountain in the rugged Orizaba countryside. Orizaba being right here. This is the Orizaba countryside. And actually, she's describing an event that happened here at the foot of this volcano, the Citlaltépetl, very close to this river, River Jamapa. The musicians were a part of a royal procession escorting their aged king, Yunga, to the spot where a Spanish captive awaited the worst. The African monarch reassured the trembling Spaniard that, solely by having seen his face, he was assured life. After ordering the man fed, Yunga released him to deliver a rude challenge to the Spanish forces that were bent on destroying his settlement. Spaniards who wrote about this event were shocked by the arrogance of Yunga's missive. Recounting his many victories against the Spaniards, Yunga condemned them as cruel, treacherous, and cowardly, ironically deploying many of the same stereotypical insults Spaniards levied against the Maroons. He challenged the Spanish troops to follow the bearer of the letter, who would guide them back to the Maroon stronghold. Finally, Yunga warned the messenger not to return with the Spanish forces if he did not wish to die with them. And you know this account, and it actually looks silly. It's like, this is the account of a fugitive slave community. These people are supposed to be hiding, right? Don't let anybody know where we're at. But this guy, the leader, he proclaims himself a king, and he's actually bluffing. He's bluffing to a Spanish army that is coming to get him. He's bluffing. And at first sight, it sounds maybe unreasonable or not very intelligent, but then if you read a little bit of African history, this is this is standard procedure in African kingdoms when you are challenging a rival kingdom to come and get you if they want to. This is very much a case of Africans recreating Africa within Mexico. Now, this is the apex, this is the climax of the talk. So now let's flesh it out. The Spanish, like I mentioned earlier, they cultivated sugarcane in very, very large scales. And there were several provinces that were very strong in their cultivation of sugar. There were, and yes, who was the first person to start cultivating sugar? Well, it was none other than the conquistador, the person who conquered Mexico, Hernán Cortés himself. And ingenios means large plantations that include a sugar mill and a refinery. They have the whole factory. This is horizontal integration to the max, okay? They control the entire process from the moment you plant the cane to the moment you refine it into sugar, and then derivatives like molasses and other. And of course, rum, alcohol, which is a major product of sugarcane. And then you see the laundry list of ingenios. These are major enterprises. These are enterprises that were probably 120,000 acres each. These are enterprises as big as the 17th century tobacco plantations in Virginia. And then you have trapiches, which were a little bit smaller. And then cañaverales. Okay, cañaverales were very, very small enterprises. Small enterprises that did not have any processing centers. They had to sell the cane, the raw cane, to others. But you see, this is just the province of Veracruz. 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. Okay, this is just one province. And each of these states is in the tens of thousands of acres. So sugar is very, very profitable in some areas, obviously, and it depends on slave labor. And again, slave labor is so brutal, and now, now that we have become very aware recently about the imperial sugar in Sugarland and the way that they were convicts to death in the 20th century, 100 years ago. The way that was done, well, it's actually, the process is that primitive. The process goes back, except these people actually have an interest in keeping their slaves alive. Whereas in the convict list system, many of these people were worked to death. In some cases, I saw one of the archaeologists, the chief archaeologist, show me some of his notes. Some of these people were worked to death within 5 weeks, 3 weeks. So sugar is really, really important. So that should tell you why slaves would escape, why they would escape. And also, the region that they escaped to is actually, this is an aerial view of Pico de Orizaba, the volcano to which they flee. And unfortunately, we haven't had archaeologists come and uncover the place. It would be awesome if they could, and actually conduct an archaeological investigation of the place, but we don't even know the exact location, because these Maroons that were around, these fugitive slaves that were around this mountain, had 8 linked settlements. These are places that are very, very hard to reach. So what happens is this. Basically, the short story is this. There's one slave, his name is Yunga. We just had him introduced. He's born around the 1540s in today's Gambia, Western Africa. In 1570, around the 1570s, he escapes the sugarcane fields, along with a group of warriors. And they escape into the mountains. And they're going to remain at large for about 50 years. It's pretty awesome. In the meantime, they're going to take women captive, and also children, to have their population grow. And the people that they take captive is going to include Spaniards and Indians. And also there are going to be people who join them. Some of them fugitives, some of them will actually be people who committed crimes. There will also be many Indians who want to escape the exploitation, the colonial exploitation, and the population of these places is going to grow, whereas these eight linked settlements are going to grow to a total of about 500 people. 500 people that are at large. This brings us to 1608. In 1608, this is the time when the Spaniards have had enough. They have had enough, and they send an army to crush these fugitives, these Maroons, these communities. They send an army, and this is the army that Yunga is challenging. Yunga has about 80 warriors. He captures a Spaniard and he sends a message: come and get us if you can, but you'll die if you try. Okay? So this is this group of 80 warriors are facing a force of approximately Okay, they are a force of about 80 fugitive slaves resisting a Spanish colonial army composed of about 100 Spaniards, 150 Indian archers, and about 200 additional adventurers. Okay, so that altogether is what? It's 450 people. 80 warriors against 450 well-armed colonial army. And they resist. So now I want to introduce you to this person. His name is David Aradia. I have not done enough research to know where he's at. It seems like he lives in the US. And recently he has been doing these cartoons, these animated films. And this one is about 3 minutes. It's really, really cool. This film is about 3 minutes. And it tells the story of Yunga in a very, very broad, very broadly. Thank you. This is one account of the story of Yunga. You know, and this actually makes me very, very glad, because when I was doing my dissertation, there was a lot less. And now this account is actually the most accurate that we have out there, and maybe the most professionally made so far. And this is, I mean, it's good to have, you know, things like this. And of course, you know, it's out there for all kinds of audiences, including children. So it's not going to tell you about much of the violence that occurred, but it is overall accurate. And now that we have seen, you know, like the apex of the story, now let's talk about the ramifications, the meaning of the story. This actually, my wife actually drew this map. You know, he has her name here and her signature. And this is a map I used for my dissertation, and this is the area that I studied. This is Colonial Mexico City right here upon a lake. These are some of the major volcanoes. And this right here, Citlaltépetl, this is where Yunga and his rebels escaped to. And in 1608, when the Spanish launched this expedition that had, 100 Spaniards, 150 Indian archers, and then another 200 adventurers or so, there was a Jesuit among them. He was not the first priest to have lived with them. Before him, there was a Franciscan who lived there for a while in 1507, trying to convert these fugitives to standard Orthodox Catholicism. And they were Catholic, but they were faux Catholics, popular Catholics, so their Catholicism resembled more that of, it had a lot of African elements, and the church was very uneasy. The church leaders were very nervous about that. And this is one of the observations. And so this observation, when I saw it, it actually reminded me of images I had seen of African villages, because this is kind of like, not necessarily that this is what the priest saw, but this is what he imagined when he came to the settlement. He imagined something like this. He says they lived in a series of about 8 linked settlements that included more than 80 able-bodied warriors, large numbers of black children who had been born in those mountains, as well as 24 black women and some Indian men and women. They had already planted banana farms and other fruit trees, cotton, chili, tobacco, pumpkins, corn, beans, sugarcane, and other vegetables. Half the inhabitants worked in agriculture, while the other half served in the militia. Indian women and men also joined them. Well, some of these people who joined them did not join them by choice. They were taken captive. But in many cases, after being taken captive, like we see in the stories, in the captivity stories of Native Americans who took European captives in the US, they actually adopted these people into their midst and treated them as members of the community, as full citizens of the community. And this account by Juan Laurencio is really unique, because usually we have very little idea what happened within these fugitive slave settlements. And there we have a Jesuit priest who left an account, and then a Franciscan who wrote a much shorter account. The account by the Franciscan is maybe about 7 pages. It's just a letter, whereas the account by Juan Laurencio, is a whole chapter in a book. And it's a book that when I was writing my dissertation, I found at UT. I had to travel to UT and photograph, and then came back, and now it's on Google Books. So now you can just go to the Google Books and download it, and download the PDF. And so things have changed in just a few years. I mean, I was traveling to UT in 2015. It's only 3 years ago. and now it's online. And I recently found it online, of course, downloaded it. So it's a chapter, and then there was another edition. There's another edition that the one on the right, that is just a brief pamphlet where the editors took the chapter from this much larger book and published it. And this one is recent. This one is one that you can actually find in, I actually purchased this one on Amazon.com. There was a used copy somewhere that got shipped from somewhere in the US that somebody had. So this is an account that can be found, and it is very, very unique. It's somebody that actually lived with the Maroons for a while. And then another reason that I found this very, very fascinating is because I found accounts of Maroons in very near my home. Very near my home. I am from the state of Guanajuato, and I found this account at the National Archive in Mexico City, and this is a photograph of the actual document. It's a photograph that I took, and it's written in, of course, this is handwritten in 16th century Spanish. And I had no idea how to read paleography. I struggle a lot. And actually, somebody's here. It's Dr. Jaramillo, Dr. Alejandra Jaramillo back there, and she helped me because she's actually an expert in colonial documents. She wrote a dissertation using Nahua-based documents in colonial Mexico, and she helped me transcribe this document. But basically, in documents like this, I found that there were Maroon settlements. They were fugitive slave communities in my hometown, in Guanajuato, very far. What is the closest thing that we have in Guanajuato to the sugar plantations? The silver mines. These were many people who escaped the silver mines. And you see that many of the patterns are similar. For example, they are raiding Indian villages. They are capturing women and taking them captive and keeping them captive for a lifetime. So many of the patterns are similar. This is a different take of the same place on Pico de Orizaba. We saw the aerial photograph by NASA, but this is another view, and very close to this volcano is a river, and the river runs from the volcano all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and this strip of land from the volcano to the Gulf of Mexico was home to some of the richest sugar plantations in colonial Latin America. These were places that enslaved tens of thousands of people, where you had conditions where some of them managed to escape and live in freedom. And so this is another image of that same volcano. And while doing research about this topic, I also happened to know somebody, and this is a friend, by the way, that I met, a friend from the church that I used to attend, and I don't know him face to face. I knew he was the pastor of another congregation. He's the pastor of a congregation in Veracruz. I mostly knew him by social media. 2015, there was social media already. and then I started just saying, hey, the town of San Lorenzo. Oh, yeah, Yunga, yeah, it's down the street. It's actually like 10 miles from here. And what do you know about him? And then I learned that he was the local historian, the cronista oficial. He's the cronista oficial from Córdoba. And he sent me, that's just an email, when I was asking him. And that email included these words that I translated. Oh, by the way, the other documents most of them were in Spanish, but I translated them. And this is what he had to say about Yunga. He said, Yunga was an African prince, and because he was an African prince, he proved him very difficult to defeat. So he means that African nobles were very learned in matters of warfare. They knew a lot about military strategy. Out of his trenches, he organized a series of attacks to the caravans that traveled from the port of Veracruz to Mexico City. Now, why would that bother the Spanish so much? Well, it was because of this. Mexico was the richest silver producer. Followed closely, a close second was Bolivia, the mines of Potosí. All this silver was shipped from Mexico to Spain, and that's what made the Spanish Empire very, very rich. This silver was collected in Mexico City, and then it was carried by mule trains because the roads were too rough for wagons. Mule trains from Mexico City across these several mountain ranges. They had to go around the volcanoes. They had to go around here. And they had no choice. They had to go very close to the Citlaltépetl volcano. They could go north or south. It didn't matter. But actually, they had to go north to avoid crossing the river because this is a very wide river. So they had to take these mule trains And these damn Maroons, these damn fugitive slaves are attacking the mule trains. They are attacking the trains that are transporting Spanish silver from Mexico to Madrid. So they are disrupting actually the Spanish Empire. So as a result, the Spanish have to commit hundreds and hundreds of soldiers in every mule train. Every mule train that goes carried with silver here to Veracruz, and here it gets shipped, it gets put in ships, and from here they go around Cuba. They stay close to Cuba to avoid pirates. Professor Schimmel really likes to talk about pirates. So the ships had to be guarded. They had a squadron that was defending them because they were loaded with silver. They had to go close to Havana, and then from Havana they had to go around and go close to San Augustine. And San Augustine was also another major fort where the Spanish had also much of their navy to protect them, because you had English and French corsairs. These are like private or buccaneers or privateers. I don't know, the terminology escapes me at this point. But these are basically pirates that are at the service of the crown that are there to plunder these ships, which is going to introduce us to another point in the lecture. So these fugitive slaves are harassing them, and as a result, they are making it very expensive to transport this silver. And that's the bloodline of the Spanish Empire. So there's a reason to try to crush these people. And there are many other reasons, but today I'm going to try to make it brief. I don't know if I'm accomplishing that. But here, I like to imagine these raids very similar to this this comic novel actually, by Kyle Baker about Nate Turner. And it's used a lot in high schools, and it's an account, I will admit I haven't read it. I read about it, but I haven't read it. And this is how he imagined Nate Turner. Well, this is how I imagine Yunga, because he's raiding for horses. He's also raiding and trading with the plantations and with fugitive slaves and with Indians. He's getting guns, and he has 80 warriors. And this is cavalry. They have horses. Each of them has a healthy horse. And so you have 80 warriors. These are fast-moving troops. These are like guerrilla. They operate like guerrillas in that they attack and they disappear almost immediately. So they're giving hell to their. This is really a pain for the Spanish Empire. So no surprise that they are going to commit a very large force to go and crush them. But crushing them is not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. Again, actually, we talked about this one. Because the settlement is pretty large, and because these are very good warriors. In 1590, a second warrior that is very important joins the community. His name is Francisco. Some people call him Francisco Angola, whereas Yunga was from Senegambia, near today's Senegal, in today's Sierra Leone. Francisco was from the area known as today's Angola. And this young captain, Yunga is getting very old. Now he's in his 70s. This guy is young, and he's a military genius. So Francisco Angola is going to become like the second in command, and he's going to defend the settlements. And this resembles, to me, the ideas that we have of Maroons, of fugitive slaves who escape. Like we see this, the case of Yunga and Francisco Angola, and then many of these other soldiers. I like to imagine them the way that Haitians imagine a fugitive slave, and that is, he's broken the chains of slavery, he's blowing a horn, he's blowing a shell, and he has a knife. And this is a knife, this is actually a short machete that is used for cutting sugarcane, because sugarcane and chains go hand in hand. So we get to a point, and this image is actually from Jamaica, but it also kind of resembles what Yunga does in actually bluffing, and actually bluffing and challenging, come and get me if you can. Telling that to the Spaniards, and when the Spanish attack, he has a series of settlements, he has a series of traps, and they just retreat higher and higher into the mountain. And eventually, they actually drive him out of the mountain, but they don't get him to surrender. This is 1609. They are going to surrender in 1618. It's going to take another 9 years. It's going to be, and so the battles that follow, the following 9 years, I like to think of them in a little bit like Geronimo and the Apache, fleeing the cavalry. Geronimo with a small handful of warriors challenging one of the biggest superpowers on earth. And here you have Yunga with 80 warriors, now less than 80 because some of them are dead, and they're dragging like another 400 civilians, women, children, elderly, and they manage to fight the Spanish for 9 years. And they come here from the Citlaltépetl, they come around these mountains near Tehuacan, and finally settle a truce. In 1618, everybody's exhausted. The Spanish are exhausted, Yunga is exhausted, and they manage this truce. And it looks like this. The Spanish say, yes, all of you can be free, and we will settle you here in San Lorenzo de Cerralbo. We will settle you, and we want you in the plains, and very close to you we're going to put a Spanish settlement because we want to be looking at you. We're going to make sure that you behave. But what is even better, the Maroons, the fugitive slaves, agreed to join the Spanish armies as militias. And these are going to be the people that are going to be defending Veracruz against pirate attacks. That's why I wanted to bring the pirates into the scene. They're going to be defending Veracruz against the pirate attacks, against the British and French corsairs that are trying to attack Veracruz to get their hands on the Spanish silver. And these guys are going to be not only there to defend, but they are going to be incredibly successful. Incredibly successful to the point that the Spanish actually formed black regiments throughout the coastlines, throughout the Gulf of Mexico. These images come from the National Archive of in Seville online. Did not go to Seville yet. Steve, have you been to Seville? Yeah. You have. Well, I'm jealous because I haven't. When I go, I want to go to the National Archives, actually to the Archivo General de Indias. This is online, but this proves some of the most successful and most effective troops that the Spanish have. Just like San Augustine in Florida. San Augustine, the defense of San Augustine depended largely on African troops. But the thing about it, the ones in Florida, they were fugitive slaves that had escaped from the Carolinas and Georgia. And then another account. This one I actually found the book at U of H. I found the original, and it is written in Spanish, so this is also my translation. In the late 17th century, the Italian scholar and traveler Giovanni Francesco Gemelli, or Gemelli, Carreri, okay, that's a long name, Carreri, passed through San Lorenzo. He observed, this is San Lorenzo de los Negros. Upon entering these hotlands, I saw parrots of several species and countless numbers of domesticated turkeys. After marching for about 4 hours, I came upon the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros, located in the midst of a forest. Since this place was inhabited only by blacks, when we entered, we felt as if we were in Africa. These were handsome blacks who worked very hard in their fields. They descend from fugitive slaves. They were allowed to live in freedom as long as they refused to abscond other fugitive slaves and instead turn them in to their masters, which they do faithfully. Because that was part of the deal. You are going to serve in the militias, you're going to serve in the Spanish army, and you're also going to capture fugitives. This traveler says that they're doing faithfully. But I looked at lots of documents that says that they were not. Whenever fugitive slaves came upon them, they dragged their feet and they corresponded back to the viceroy. Yes, we will surrender those people. We are working on surrendering these people. 2 years later, we are very close to surrender these people. 5 years later, these people are dead or these people escaped. They're dragging their feet. But of course, the Spanish don't want to come and attack them because these are the defense against pirates. These are the people that are defending the colony. Eventually, the descendants of these people live all over, and today they are actually in the millions, literally in the millions of African Mexicans or black Mexicans. Many of them live in the U.S. Many live in the U.S., many live in other places. Of course, Yunga still exists. The town of San Lorenzo de los Negros still exists. And this, actually this mural comes from a city that is very close to San Lorenzo, that is in Cordoba. But this other one, this one here, this is the monument to Yunga. And that's a piece of sugar cane. And he's breaking the chains. So every year, in the town of San Lorenzo de Cerralbo, also known as Yunga, they have a festival, like a carnival. They have a carnival, and of course, the biggest attraction of the carnival, and the thing that everybody's so proud of, is the reenactment of the resistance of Yunga and his 80 warriors, and plus another 400 and some civilians against the Spanish forces. And that is the high point of life in the town of Yunga. Now, to debrief, this talk was largely about the significance of African culture to Mexico, but it's also linked to other stories, okay? Other stories, the story of slave resistance, the stories of a multicultural society. Like Mexico is actually very, very diverse. I mean, recently there have been large waves of African immigrants coming into Mexico in recent years because it's very hard to, actually many of them want to come to the US, but it's very hard to come into the US, so they come to Mexico. Many do, not every, many come to Mexico, and many do stay in Mexico. And also, this is also a country, this is also a place where people are becoming very, very aware of this heritage. Where it is safe to say that the average Mexican, if you are to trace your DNA, very, very common, it's very, very common to find 10% African among your ancestors. It's very, very common. And some people say, oh yeah, sure, but I'm Spanish. Well, okay, yeah. You speak Spanish, and probably, but that's like another story. So yeah, I'm going to bring this to an end because we're hoping to have if you open this for questions. I'm very happy I'm very glad, and I welcome you, appreciate your attention, and the fact that you brought me here and that you stayed the whole time. All right, thank you.